What makes a murderer?
He swung himself around and fired twice. One caught him in the arm, the other one went off somewhere.
Can scientists identify the neurological factors that drive people to brutal extremes?
That's going to make them more willing and more capable of performing violent acts.
Are killers born, or are they made?
It's a strong emotion. It's one that propels a person to vengeance and to violence.
It wasn't just a happenstance, haphazard murder spree of a year. It was 50 weeks of planned killing.
And which of them is most evil? A scale exists to measure the darkest corners of human behavior. It weighs the criminal mind and the crime. From impulsive murderers to serial killers, this 22-point scale attempts to determine who are the most evil. In 1972, Edmund Kemper cruised the streets of Santa Cruz, California, looking for hitchhikers. He tortured and dismembered his victims, ultimately claiming 10 lives. 1978, Sacramento, California. Voices told Richard Chase to consume the organs and blood of other human beings, or he would die. He slaughtered 6 people. 2002, Houston, Texas. Clara Harris discovered her husband was having an affair. In a rage, she ran him over in a hotel car park, then watched him die. Why do people kill? Are murderers ordinary people driven to violent extremes? Are their acts of evil triggered by childhood trauma? Or the result of malfunctions in the brain? Scientists are using different techniques to discover what's inside the mind of a killer. Dr. Michael Stone is the creator of the 22-level scale of evil. For decades, he has investigated the concept of evil, examining the most horrific crimes committed by some of the world's most brutal killers.
I'm often asked what common threads exist between killers, and whether killers are products of their nature or their environments. New research is revealing how and why people become killers and what makes them different from the rest of us.
Researchers can now use MRI and other complex technologies to investigate the physiological roots of human behavior. But simple psychological experiments can also yield important insights about the human mind. Dr. Roy Baumeister studies self-control, violence, and aggression at Florida State University. He believes that the motivation for many violent acts can be traced to something we all experience: social rejection.
Being included is basic to our survival. I think what happens in rejected people is their emotion system has shut down. Most of the people who have committed most newsworthy crimes, school shootings, the spree and mass killers, have felt rejected and excluded by multiple people.
Baumeister theorizes that social exclusion, being ostracized by one's family or peers, can change people both physically and emotionally by diminishing their ability to feel pain. This, in turn, can open the door to violence and even murder.
This feeling that others don't like you, that they don't want to have you around, that they don't want to be with you, this presses some buttons deep in the psyche, and certainly most people deal with it in a more constructive manner, but for some people it does lead to an outburst of violence.
Feelings of rejection may have triggered one of the most terrifying killing sprees in the history of New York City. Dr. Roy Baumeister believes that social rejection can change people both physically and emotionally, and may ultimately lead to acts of violence, even murder. This could explain the case of the notorious New York killer, the Son of Sam. Richard David Falco was born in New York in 1953. Immediately put up for adoption, he was taken in and raised by Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz. David grew up racked by feelings of rejection. In his teens, his adoptive mother died, and not long afterwards, his adoptive father moved to Florida. Berkowitz became increasingly isolated. He lived alone and had few friends. In May of 1975, Berkowitz found and contacted his birth mother and discovered that she had a daughter. He was crushed by the fact that she had kept one child but had given him up. 1 year later, he shot 2 women at random. The media attention the crime elicited was intoxicating. He began sending letters to police and journalists promising more murders. His rampage lasted 19 months and claimed 6 lives. When police finally apprehended him, he said, "I'm the son of Sam. What took you so long?" Dr. Roy Baumeister believes feelings of isolation and rejection may have fueled Berkowitz's killing spree. In an experiment designed to discover if such feelings can lead to violence, Dr. Baumeister first measured the physical pain threshold of test subjects.
The person comes in and we assess pain by, there's a small device that you put on the person's finger and it gradually increases the pressure.
The subjects indicated when they began to feel pain and when the pain became intolerable.
The purpose of the first step is to get a baseline measure of how sensitive to pain the person is.
Dr. Baumeister then created a feeling of social rejection. Participants were given a personality questionnaire and told it was part of the research. But instead of receiving honest feedback, some subjects were told their questionnaires indicated that they would live a life of solitude.
You might have friends and relationships now, but by your mid-20s, most of these will have drifted away.
After experiencing this rejection, the subjects were again tested.
We administer the pain measure exactly the same as we did the first time, and this enables us to see, has the person's sensitivity to pain changed?
The rejection seemed to have a significant effect.
They are effectively numb. They will sit there for a much longer time before they say it starts to hurt. It doesn't seem to bother them as much.
Baumeister is uncertain why people who have been socially rejected quickly develop an increased pain threshold. But he thinks that the physical experience of pain is not the only thing that changes. A person's emotional sensitivity may also become impaired. The subject's inability to register their own pain could lead to an inability to recognize suffering in others, diminishing feelings of empathy.
Empathy holds us back from doing cruel and violent and hurtful things to others, and if people lose this capacity to feel sorry for others, that's going to make them more willing and more capable of performing violent acts.
But does it follow that an impaired ability to empathize leads to a greater propensity to kill? For David Berkowitz, the apparent rejection by his birth mother and death of his adoptive mother may have crippled his sense of empathy.
If you want to speculate about the effects of accumulated rejections, whether this lack of empathy would then become chronic so that you would feel it all the time, it's a very disturbing thought. Certainly, it seems a very likely extension of the patterns that we've observed.
Throughout history, many killers have had backgrounds filled with rejection, both as children and adults. The variety of their crimes cover the entire spectrum of my scale, from impulse crimes all the way to torture, suggesting that social rejection and isolation certainly have some connection to violence.
Some killers appear to have been primed for violence by rejection and isolation. That suggests we may all have the potential to commit murder. But it also may be possible that the brains of some individuals are fundamentally different from others. Perhaps there's a physiological explanation for certain brutal killers, those like Edmund Kemper.
It wasn't just a happenstance, haphazard murder spree of a year. It was 50 weeks of planned killing.
Santa Cruz, California, 1972. Edmund Kemper prowled the streets. One night, he picked up two hitchhikers, female university students, and killed them in his car. Kemper took the bodies home, where he dismembered them. He stored some of the body parts in his refrigerator as trophies and discarded the rest along the California coast. Over the next 12 months, he murdered 4 more female hitchhikers. Finally, he bludgeoned and then decapitated his mother as she slept. His ultimate death toll was 10. How can a person inflict such extreme cruelty?
Without empathy, it's very difficult to be compassionate because you need to understand the emotional states of others.
Marco Iacoboni is a neuroscientist at the University of California at Los Angeles. He believes that such brutality may be caused by the malfunction of a class of brain cells known as mirror neurons.
What mirror neurons do is to really be the building block of social behavior in our brain.
Iacoboni studies the role mirror neurons play in empathy and violence. He believes these neurons tell the brain how to read and interpret the emotions of others.
Suppose that my cells fire in my brain when I'm distressed, and so I make some facial expressions that really express my distress. Turns out that the same cells fire when I see other people that are distressed.
Iacoboni thinks that people whose mirror neurons don't function properly cannot feel empathy, and that the inability to recognize pain being felt by others makes violent behavior more likely. To test this hypothesis, Iacoboni conducted functional MRI scans of test subjects' brains while they were being shown pictures of people expressing happiness or anger. The subjects were first told to observe the images. Then they were instructed to mimic the emotions. The results were intriguing. The scans show that the subject's mirror neurons were communicating with 2 parts of the brain. Neural activity starts in the region responsible for muscle movement. The mirror cells instructed the brain to literally mirror the observed action. The cells then sent signals to the brain's emotional centers, creating an understanding of the perceived emotion. The process connects an action to an emotion, making empathy possible.
When I feel certain emotions, I express those emotions with my own body, with my own face.
Iacoboni further tested his theory by examining autistic individuals who generally lack the ability to empathize.
And I want you to point to the face that shows how she's feeling in the picture. Show me angry.
Autistics can describe emotions.
Angry. Embarrassed.
But many have difficulty feeling or expressing them.
Show me joy.
Functional MRI scans of the autistic subjects showed very little mirror neuron activity. The more severe the autism, the less activity in the mirror neuron system. While there's no correlation between autism and violence, Iacoboni believes that a lack of communication between mirror neurons and the emotional centers of the brain may inhibit empathy and help explain a tendency toward violence. Further study could help explain the lack of empathy shown by killers like Edmund Kemper.
Physical impairment or defect in the brain can certainly play a role in violence or murder. While the violence brought on by such a defect can be extreme, the instances of such defects are rare. There are, however, other potential disturbances inside the brain that can lead to violence and murder. In combination, social rejection, coupled with physical impairment in the brain, play a role in violence or murder. Mental illness is the key factor behind delusional killers who then lash out against a false reality.
Delusions and the distorted reality they create can sometimes drive people to murder. The link between murder and mental illness is evident in some rare but disturbing cases. Sacramento, 1978. 27-year-old Richard Chase heard voices telling him to consume the blood and organs of others in order to survive. He went on a killing spree that resulted in 6 deaths. Chase suffered from schizophrenia, a mental illness that affects 1% of the population. Those who suffer from the disease can experience an alternate reality filled with disembodied voices and distorted perceptions. For many years, it was unclear whether schizophrenia was a psychological disorder or if it was caused by physical changes in the brain. Now researchers can peer inside the brains of schizophrenic patients.
One of the mysteries is what is happening in the brain as schizophrenia strikes.
Dr. Paul Thompson is a neurologist at the University of California at Los Angeles.
One of the things we're interested in is, can we scan people with schizophrenia and try and understand what's happening in the brain as they develop delusions and psychosis and hallucinations?
Over a 5-year period, Thompson conducted 3 MRI brain scans of 12 schizophrenic patients. His goal was to create a sort of time-lapse movie, providing a glimpse of how schizophrenia affects the brain. The first scan was done shortly after diagnosis.
And this is when a patient first develops signs of hearing voices, having sensations that are irrational, and an inability to understand whether sounds are real or whether they're in their head.
As he examined his data, Thompson made a remarkable discovery.
When we began, we thought maybe the changes were psychological. What we actually saw was this dynamic wave of tissue loss. So when a patient first has signs of hallucinations and delusions, they're actually rapidly losing brain tissue.
In the first year of the disease, patients lost 5% of their brain tissue. 2 years later, they were scanned again. The images revealed a marked progression.
The biggest surprise is that although the damage starts at the back of the brain, there's this massive avalanche of brain tissue loss that ends up at the front of the brain. So one of the things that you see here in red colors, slow loss of gray matter that proceeds forward like a forest fire.
The final scans, made 5 years after diagnosis, showed that the damage had spread to the frontal lobes, the region of the brain responsible for reasoning and many higher functions.
And this is the area that makes sense of all the perceptions that you have. So as the wave of loss moves forward, you'll begin to have thoughts unraveling, and you may begin to have delusions about who you are, or you may not understand what's going on in the world at all. 5 years into the illness, you end up with about a 25% deficit, about a quarter of the brain tissue being lost in schizophrenia. These brain cells can never be replaced.
Dr. Thompson's findings offer valuable insight into the nature of schizophrenia. It physically attacks the brain, twists perceptions, and gives rise to delusional thought. Richard Chase's schizophrenia destroyed his ability to accurately perceive reality, and his delusions propelled him to violence.
Criminals driven by mental illness are spread over a wide range on my scale. The unifying factor is that many of them, like Richard Chase, have created a distorted or delusional reality. Their unwavering belief in the world they have created can often make them desperate and incredibly dangerous. Science will continue, we can hope, to unravel the mysteries that drive them to kill.
While mental illness is relatively common in violent criminals, only a small percentage of schizophrenics actually commit violent acts. One scientist thinks he knows what accounts for the violent tendencies among this minority group.
The brains of these individuals are wired differently. They may be more likely to commit violent acts because they're incapable of stopping the impulses to do so.
Dr. Michael Stone is examining the role that mental illness plays in driving killers to commit their evil acts. Some of the most horrific crimes, like those of Richard Chase, the so-called vampire of Sacramento, can be attributed to the ravaging effects of schizophrenia. Only a small number of schizophrenics are violent, but one scientist has a theory about why violent tendencies develop in that minority.
What we're trying to do here is go a step beyond just establishing a relationship between schizophrenia and violence.
Robert Shug is a researcher in the Department of Psychology at the University of Southern California. He studies a group of violent subjects who suffer not only from a mild form of schizophrenia, but also antisocial personality disorder.
The main element that characterizes antisocial personality disorder is a blatant disregard for the rights and welfare of others. These people don't follow rules, they consistently break laws, and they won't display any remorse for the things that they've done.
For Shug, people with both schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder constitute a distinct group, one that is prone to violent behavior. To test this theory, he devised a simple experiment focusing on a crucial region of the brain, the prefrontal cortex.
We get these very intense impulses coming from lower areas of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex says, no, I will not act out on these impulses. It really keeps us on a day-to-day basis from acting out violently. It's the brakes on the car.
If Shug is correct, individuals with both disorders will have a deficit in the prefrontal cortex. Subjects were told that they would hear a series of tones.
Whenever anything new enters our environment, our bodies will react on a biological level. When the participant hears the stimulus in his headphone, his body will react with that sort of what is it response.
The subjects' bodies responded by producing a small amount of perspiration, which was measured by electrodes on their fingers. These reactions are controlled by the prefrontal cortex. The more a subject perspires, the more activity in the prefrontal cortex. As subjects acclimated to the tone, a new, more alarming sound was produced.
What we want to see is if their bodies will respond to more socially meaningful sounds.
As he suspected, subjects with both conditions showed lower responses than did control subjects.
The brains of these individuals are wired differently. So if you get a group of individuals where their prefrontal cortex is not functioning, they may be more likely to commit violent acts because they're incapable of stopping the impulses to do so. What may be happening here is that these folks are taking a double hit. They're experiencing the deficits associated with the schizophrenia-like symptoms. They're also experiencing the symptoms associated with the antisocial personality symptoms. They're in essence at a double risk for acting out violently in a criminal fashion or antisocially.
But even multiple psychological disorders cannot explain the behavior of some killers.
Mental illness is a contributing factor among many killers I have investigated. But I have also come across those who rely on high intelligence to help them commit murder and also evade capture. In these cases, it is a seemingly healthy brain that can be lethal.
1983. Diane Downs claimed a hitchhiker had shot her and her 3 children, killing one of them.
He swung himself around and fired twice. One caught me in the arm, the other one I went off somewhere.
Downs portrayed herself as a victim to the media.
Anything to help out and find the guy that shot my kids.
But when one of Downs' surviving children was finally able to recount the actual events, she said her mother had pulled the trigger. Diane Downs had misled the police and the public for months about her heinous crime. Dr. Scott Farrow at Temple University in Philadelphia studies the neurology of lying. He wants to determine whether the brain operates differently when people are lying compared to when they're telling the truth. He recruited 11 test subjects for an experiment.
As part of our test today, I'm going to ask you to shoot a gun, left hand over right hand. You're going to squeeze the trigger.
6 subjects were instructed to shoot a pistol containing blanks.
I understand. Will do.
And imagine they were at a crime scene. The other 5 did not shoot the gun. After they had fired the gun, subjects were placed in an MRI machine, allowing Dr. Farrow to monitor the activity in their brains as they lied.
You're going to hear a series of questions. The goal is for you to try to deceive. Your goal is to lie. Is today Tuesday?
No.
Did Dr. Farrow ask you to shoot that gun today?
No.
Did you shoot that gun today?
No.
Our theory was that there would be more activation in the brain when one lied. Can we show and prove that there's more areas of the brain that activated in the group that lied compared to the group that told the truth?
The scan showed that lying triggered activity in 14 parts of the brain, twice as many as became active when subjects told the truth.
The red represents, again, the exact areas that are activating within different parts of the brain in the group that lied.
The parts of the brain activated during lying involve emotions and high-functioning activities such as inhibition, memory, and planning. In a sense, when people lie, they have to be smarter than when they tell the truth.
The brain has to work harder when you're lying because the individual that is trying to deceive and beat a test has to come up with an opposite response. When one is deceiving, you have to actually block a natural response. You also have to have a blockage of an emotional response, so the guilt, the anxiety, the frustration, the apprehension, all that has to be blocked. The memory responses of the brain also have to be blocked because you clearly have a memory of that crime that was committed. When you're telling the truth, it's relatively easy.
Could this increased brain function make it easier for liars to commit crimes?
Scheming, deceitful killers like Diane Downs use their intelligence to help them evade detection. Their crimes are often particularly heinous because, unlike those with mental illness, they are aware and fully responsible for their actions. Unfortunately, even the most gifted can be among the most deadly.
Diane Downs was part of a distinct minority. Fewer than 1 in 5 murderers is female.
Men have a reputation for being the more violent gender, and statistics certainly support that. More than 80% of all homicides in the United States each year are committed by men. This begs the question, do men and women have different triggers for murder, and what are those triggers?
June 1996, Biddeford, Maine. Samuel and Lucinda Collins had been married for 10 years and had an 8-year-old son. They were known by friends and neighbors as a loving and affectionate family. But a few weeks later, Samuel discovered that his wife was having an affair. He stabbed her to death that same day. 2002. David and Clara Harris appeared to have a picture-perfect life. Children, a successful business, a beautiful home. But Clara learned that David was seeing another woman. She was not willing to give up her marriage, so she tried to make herself more attractive to David by getting fit and using a tanning bed. She demanded that David never see his mistress again, and he agreed. But when Clara spotted him holding hands with his mistress outside a hotel, she ran him over with her car. He died in the car park. The motivation behind both these murders was the primal human emotion of jealousy. But it's unclear whether jealousy is the same in men and women. Dr. Randy Larson at Washington University in St. Louis believes jealousy is a hardwired emotion that reveals fundamental differences between men and women. To test his theory, he recruited 55 men and women to participate in a study.
Please have a seat. They came to the laboratory individually for a 2-hour session. Okay, I'm going to put 2 electrodes on your forehead. First one right here.
Dr. Larson used a polygraph machine to measure 3 stress indicators.
Now I'm just going to put the wire behind your ear.
Involuntary muscle movement, perspiration, and heart rate.
And the second one.
These indicators can be used to gauge the level of jealousy a person is feeling.
The physiological measures are outside of voluntary control, and so they're sort of a direct line to the autonomic nervous system, the flight or fight response that we have. Okay, we're ready to begin. So here's a button to press when you get the image in your mind.
To trigger jealous feelings, Dr. Larson presented the subjects with a scenario of emotional betrayal.
Please think of a serious romantic relationship you have had in the past, or that you currently have. Now, imagine that the person with whom you're seriously involved becomes interested in someone else. Imagine that your partner is falling in love and forming an emotional attachment to this other person.
When the participants had clearly imagined the scenario, they pressed a button. Their stress level was recorded for 20 seconds. Then Dr. Larson repeated the process.
Okay. Relax again. I have one more imagining task for you. Please think of a serious romantic relationship.
But this time, he gave them a different scenario.
Imagine you find out that your partner is having sexual intercourse with this other person. Try to feel the feelings that you would have if this happened to you.
The male subject showed a much stronger reaction to the idea of sexual betrayal. In contrast, for women, the thought of their partner falling in love with someone else was significantly more stressful. Dr. Larson's findings appear to be borne out by actual criminal cases. Clara Harris tried to save her marriage after learning that her husband was having an affair. But when she saw him with his lover after he had promised to leave her, Harris went over the edge. Samuel Collins, on the other hand, did not wait to find out how emotionally serious his wife's relationship was before he stabbed her to death. Dr. Larson believes that the gender differences in how jealousy leads to violence have been evolving for eons.
We're the receptacles of our evolutionary past. We're the children of our ancestors. And the idea is that perhaps we carry with us these evolved psychological tendencies that our ancestors developed to solve these problems. And long-term sexual reproduction is one of those problems.
Men and women mate for the same reason, to pass their genes to the next generation. But in evolutionary terms, the two sexes face different challenges.
So for a man, in our evolutionary past, the danger would be that his mate would mate with someone else. Women were always certain that the child they had was their child. Men were never certain. And so jealousy may have evolved as a mechanism in males in order to guard their mate, to be sensitive to cues of infidelity, basically to ensure that the child that their mate has was their child. For the woman, it's really no concern that her mate would mate with anyone else. That doesn't affect her probability of passing on her genes. As long as the man sticks around to help raise the child that she has, that ensures her genes being passed into the next generation. And so what the woman fears most would be the loss of that commitment from the male. Jealousy is a strong emotion. It propels a person to action, to vengeance, and to violence. This force was functional in the past. It's not so functional today. It may be dysfunctional and lead toward violence.
Clara Harris and Samuel Collins were motivated to kill by a primal emotion for which we all have the potential: jealousy. The fact that their romantic jealousy was triggered by different circumstances but caused the same result reveals that while men may typically be more impulsive in their acts of violence, women can be just as capable of murder.
Jealousy can drive some people to terrible acts of violence. Others seem to have been manipulated into becoming murderers. Some scientists believe this phenomenon has roots in a quality inherent in all of us. Scientific research shows that mental illness, social rejection, and even fundamental human emotions like jealousy can be catalysts for murder. But can a healthy person with no history of psychological trauma or mental illness be convinced to kill another human being?
Most of us with no criminal background think that we are incapable of turning to extreme violence or murder. But history has shown that even the most innocent seeming can, under certain circumstances, be capable of horrific acts.
Tex Watson was a top student and athlete. Leslie Van Houten, the daughter of a teacher, was extremely popular in secondary school. Susan Atkins sang in her school and church choirs and was known as a quiet and reserved child. Patricia Krenwinkel taught at a Sunday school and hoped to become a nun. All were from middle-class American families. August 1969. Watson, Van Houten, Krenwinkel and Atkins went on a killing spree that left 7 people dead. They were followers of Charles Manson. Apparently normal teenagers somehow had been transformed into violent murderers. the reason why may lie in a fundamental weakness in the human psyche, the powerful need to conform, to belong to a group. In the 1950s, psychologist Dr. Solomon Asch was among the first to examine this phenomenon.
Asch decided he wanted to see whether there was something weird or special about people who followed crazy leaders, or whether the average person, under the right circumstances, could be made to conform.
Asch's conformity experiment is legendary among social psychologists like Dr. Benjamin Zablocki.
Solomon Asch's concern was with conformity, and he wanted to see whether he could set up an experimental situation in which people would be led by social pressure to deny the evidence of their own senses and go along with the judgment of a group on a simple question which had to do with the length of lines.
The test began by placing the subject in a room with a group of actors. They were all shown a pair of cards. The first had a line drawn on it, while the second had several lines. All the participants were asked to pick the line that matched the one on the first card.
Everyone else, all of the actors who are pretending to be experimental subjects, give the wrong answer.
B.
After all of these actors have given the wrong answer, the turn comes to the real experimental subject.
The experiment tested whether the real subject would ignore the group and answer correctly, or if the pressure to conform would compel them to give the wrong answer.
It's A.
Initially, many of them gave the correct answer, albeit reluctantly.
Most people hesitate. They exhibit externally the conflict that's going on inside them between the desire to be a part of the group and the desire to follow the evidence of their own eyes.
As the experiment continued, most subjects changed their response.
A. A.
A.
It's A.
What's found is that 75% of the experimental subjects deny the evidence of their own eyesight and conform or go along with what other people have said. It was not because they had legitimate reason to be unsure, but because they were swept away by this power of conformity to the unanimous group opinion.
Among scientists, this behavior is known as groupthink.
A.
It illustrates the power cult leaders can wield when they create a unified group mind among their followers. Charles Manson was able to control his followers even from a distance.
What's interesting and very scary about the Manson family is that Charlie Manson himself was not present at any of the famous murders, Tate murders, the LaBianca murders, that his followers carried out. They were so brainwashed by the cult experience that they would carry out these acts even when Charlie Manson was not actually there to supervise them. That's a big step further down the road to nightmarish compliance that is seen in cults.
Manson turned a number of seemingly successful, well-adjusted people into murderers. That suggests that inside all of us, there is a certain vulnerability that, should a collection of factors come together, could lead us to commit acts we didn't think possible.
Scientists will continue to probe the factors that drive people to kill and try to uncover the secrets that lurk inside the killer's mind. And Dr. Stone will continue his quest to comprehend murderers, hoping that one day we will be able to fully understand and also prevent the acts of those who are most evil.